Perfect. All right. Thank you. So here to talk today about nitrogen. You're putting it in your field. It's a big investment. We want to make sure it's staying where you put it, so that way you're not having the losses, and it's going to be there for when your crop needs it. So we'll kind of go through, and the first things we'll kind of cover is a little bit on where that nitrogen is actually going. So when you put it out on your field, your nitrogen is going to eventually make its way into the soil. That's where we want it to be. And eventually it's either going to get taken up by the plant or there's going to be some potential loss mechanisms. So we kind of have three major loss pathways that we're focused on when it comes to our nitrogen applications. So we've got volatilization, we've got leaching, and denitrification. We'll kind of go through each of these and talk about what's happening, and then we'll kind of circle around and kind of go through some of the 4 R's and kind of focus on what we can do to help prevent these losses specifically with each of those R's. So up first, let's focus on volatilization. The reason we want to focus on volatilization is because this is going to be your number one form of loss you're going to see if you're putting any urea down. So that's urea prils, 4600 or anything that contains that, or your UAN, because of course UAN is half urea. So those two different ones, the number one source of loss will be volatilization. So we want to kind of start there, and this is what's going to happen close to the surface. So how does volatilization happen? So when we kind of put urea out on the field, it's a great product, it's nice and stable, but unfortunately for us, urea can't be taken up by the plant. So it is an inaccessible form of nitrogen for your plant. It does need to get all the way down here, all the way down to ammonia. And how does it do that? Well, we need 3 things to happen in the field. Number 1, we got to put urea out there. Number 2, we're going to have water because it's a hydrolysis process. So we'll add some water out there. And number 3, we need this urease enzyme. So this enzyme is just a free-living enzyme. It's not attached to any sort of bacteria or anything like that. It's broken down from residues in the crop or microbes in the soil. Just kind of gets released in the soil, and it's pretty much everywhere. So we know we're going to have urease enzyme in your soil. We know there's going to be water eventually. At some point, there's going to be some sort of moisture that we're going to run into. So as soon as we put that urea out there, we're going to start this process. It typically happens 24 to 48 hours when we really start to see this conversion over. We're going to make carbon dioxide, and we're going to make ammonia. That's where we're going to get to with it. Now, if we have that happening on the soil, I'm sure many of you have used anhydrous ammonia or have heard about it. We don't like ammonia at the surface because it is a vapor, it goes up into the atmosphere, and that's kind of how we lost. So that's that volatilization piece, that ammonia volatilization. We want to get it down into the soil, and typically we kind of rely on 2 ways of doing that. Either it's going to be incorporation, so we're going to use equipment, or we're going to rely on water. We're going to rely on rainfall, irrigation to kind of wash that urea because it is easily dissolved into water and wash that down into the soil. So every time we get a bit of rain, that's going to move that urea farther and farther down into the soil. Now, it's not going to always stay as ammonia. We're going to get a bit of a conversion, an equilibrium into ammonium and ammonia. So ammonia is NH3, ammonium is NH4, and that ratio is really going to be driven by the pH around it, so your soil pH is what's going to drive that. So there are a number of factors that are going to go into how much ammonia volatilization you see in your field. So number 1 here, we have soil moisture. So as I mentioned, it's a hydrolysis process. So the more moisture you have, the faster this conversion is going to happen and how much ammonia you're going to lose. So we're going to need some of that. It is required, and that's going to be a big driving factor on it. Number 2, soil pH. So high soil pH shifts our equilibrium. So I talked about that ammonium equilibrium. It's going to shift it more to ammonia in those higher soil pHs. So if you're sitting in those high soil pH, 7.6, 7.9, you're going to be in a situation where you're probably going to have a potential for more ammonia volatilization losses than if you are sitting in those low soil pHs, if you have some fields that are dropping below 6, 5.5 or something like that. Now, that being said, and we'll kind of touch on this a little bit later, the actual, as we put urea down in a band within the soil, that'll actually start to spike your pH right around your urea in the soil. So that's going to play into it as well. Warmer temperatures. This can happen at right around freezing. As long as you have liquid water, it can happen, but it is an enzymatic process. So the warmer the temperature is, the faster that conversion is going to happen. The faster that conversion happens, the more we're at risk for ammonia losses. Cation exchange capacity. That's just how heavy your soil is. So what that means is if you have a heavy soil, so a clay soil, you have a really high cation exchange capacity. Now soil is inherently negatively charged. And ammonium is positively charged. So it makes sense that that's going to stick to the soil and it's going to hold on to that a little bit better. When we get to the lighter soils, coarse soils, sandy soils, it can't hold on to as much. So again, more of that's going to be prone to be able to be vapor, and we're going to have that through ammonia volatilization losses as well. And finally, high crop residues, those residuey fields. The reason this is important is that urea has to get to the soil. So if it is sitting on your crop residues, you got a lot of trash on top, and that if you go out and say you're broadcasting some urea or you're dribble banding your UAN, if it is sitting on top of your crop, it's not touching the soil, and it gets some moisture on it, that's going to start that conversion right there on top of that residue. And no matter what you're going to happen, it's all going to be lost. It's not going to get down to the soil. Again, we want it in the soil where it's going to be. So residue management is also going to play a big factor into how much of your nitrogen can be lost as ammonia through volatilization. So those are kind of the big factors that are going into it. Again, we'll kind of come back around and talk a little bit about some of the things we can do to reduce some of these losses after application or during application. The second pieces of kind of this loss are the leaching and denitrification losses. Again, these are going to be a little bit different depending on your soil type, and we'll go through some of those categories there. But leaching is just kind of that movement of nitrate down through the soil and out of the growing zone, the root zone of your crop. And denitrification is going the other way. It's kind of through saturated soils and kind of that gaseous loss that we see. Now, there are a couple forms of loss we can see. So nitrous oxide, N2O, has been kind of a big topic of recent in terms of greenhouse gas management, and that has a lot of focus on it. But it's not the only form of loss from denitrification. Nitrogen gas is also another big one that we lose, and it's actually a bigger one. We lose more nitrogen gas than nitrous oxide from denitrification, but it's much harder to kind of measure and tell because the air we're breathing right now is about 78% nitrogen gas. So it's very much a drop in the ocean in terms of the emissions. It becomes very hard to actually measure that unless you're doing it in a closed chamber, and there's a whole other scientific process you have to go. So we kind of have some estimates for that, but for the most part, it's not something that gets focused on with it. Now, if we look at kind of the amounts of loss with it, that nitrogen gas, N2 gas loss, it can be anywhere from 6 to 10% of your losses of your nitrogen as N2 gas. Nitrous oxide tends to be about 1 to 2%. So like I said, it's quite a bit more as nitrogen gas than nitrous oxide that we see losing through denitrification. So, how do we get to nitrate in terms of that potential from our ammonium? So we've got that NH4. We want to get to nitrate because that's what the crop's going to primarily take up. And it's going to happen through a process of a couple of bacteria. So this one is tied to an actual living bacteria, or a couple living bacteria. We've got Nitrosomonas bacteria, and then we've got Nitrobacter. So those are the two that are involved in making nitrate from ammonium. And why do we care if it's nitrate? So if we look at the amount of nitrogen your crop is going to take up, it's going to take up much more nitrogen as nitrate than it is going to take up as ammonium. Now, it can take some up as ammonium a little bit, and actually the plant tends to prefer ammonium. That's kind of one of its preferred forms of nitrogen. And if we go think about our legumes, so our rhizobia inoculated crops, so whether it's soybeans, peas, alfalfa, clover, etc., any of those legume crops that form that symbiotic relationship with the rhizobia in there is going to be making ammonium. So that's what the plant is going to use. But because it is positively charged, and the soil is negatively charged, it doesn't move very much in the soil. So that means the roots are going to have to find that ammonium. They're going to have to encounter it in the soil before they're going to take it up. Nitrate, on the other hand, way down at the other side, is negatively charged, and it is highly soluble within water and highly mobile within water. So as your crop is taking in water, so it's sucking up water through its roots, it's going to be pulling nitrate with it. So that nitrate coming in is going to be good because that means the crop has easy access to it, and that's why the majority of the nitrogen that crop's going to get is going to come in that nitrate form. Now, unfortunately, because it is highly soluble in water, it's going to go where water goes. So if we get a lot of rain or we've got some irrigation or something and we're getting a lot of water on there and that's going to push it down, that's where we get into that leaching standpoint. Or if we get into saturated soil conditions, that's where we get the denitrification from. So those are kind of the big ones. Now, typically, we don't have to worry too much on most years from a leaching standpoint. It's not one of the ones we're super concerned about, but it does happen. Everyone's had that 6-inch rainfall or something where you're going to get that really wet soils, and on those sandy soils, you are going to get nitrogen pushing down. Or if those saturated heavy soils, that might go with it. Or the other one too is tiling. As I mentioned, where the water is going to go, the nitrate's going to go with it. So if you've got tile out in your field and you've got water running through that, there's the potential that nitrate's going to be coming through. So one of the things we want to do is we want to kind of delay that nitrogen getting to nitrate as long as possible, because a small crop isn't taking up much water, not taking up much nitrogen, but a large crop is. So the longer we can delay that, the more likely more of that nitrate is going to go into the crop rather than lost. So what are kind of the big factors that we see? So we went through ammonia, now let's go through some of the factors that we see with denitrification and leaching. So on the leaching side, so we're going to lose that as nitrate. This is going to happen in those more coarse textured, sandier soils. Again, anytime we got water moving rapidly down through the soil profile, that's when it's taking that nitrate with it, and that's what was going to be the big cause in terms of kind of leaching losses. So again, we don't have to worry too much about that most years, because most of our fields, most of our moisture, we're not getting that kind of a situation that is going to cause big leaching losses consistently, but again, it does happen now and then. And also those high irrigation or high rainfall situations, tiling that I kind of already talked about, that's going to be kind of the ones where we're going to see more of those leaching losses. So just some of the things to consider from that standpoint. Denitrification. So denitrification comes from saturated soil. So the easy way to think about it is the bacteria in the soil, they like to use oxygen, just like we like to use oxygen. Nitrate has 3 oxygens stuck on there. It has less access to oxygen in the soil because it is being flooded with water, it's going to start pulling those oxygens off, and that's what's going to get us. You think nitrate, NO3, you think nitrous oxide, N2O, it's pulling oxygens off to get to that point. Again, we don't need a lot of water to get into some denitrification timing. So really, it's once we get to about that 60% of the filled pore space, that's when we start to see it. And in terms of, again, Western Canada, let's bring it back to the prairies here. The biggest time that we see denitrification every year is in our spring snowmelt. So right after the spring snowmelt, that is when we see our largest spike in denitrification every year. So that's going to be kind of the big factor there. So we always see those higher denitrification emissions happen early in the spring because we get that snowmelt, our soils are getting saturated, and there's nothing really growing that's going to be pulling that nitrate up. So it's all just sitting there freely available to be lost through denitrification. And temperature, so it is a biological process, so it does need those bacteria. So bacteria are going to be much more active in warm temperatures than they are in cold temperatures. So it's really going to kind of depend on the bacteria in the soil. People kind of utilize different numbers for where do bacteria stop being active in the soil. Sometimes you'll hear 10 degrees Celsius, sometimes you'll hear 8, sometimes you'll hear 5. It's really going to depend on the conditions, moisture, and the bacteria that we're talking about. But it's kind of a good rule of thumb. So if you think about 5 to 8 degrees Celsius, anything colder than that, we're not going to get any bacterial activity. We're going to only get that kind of on those warmer temperatures, which is kind of why when we think about doing nitrogen applications, if anyone's doing fall nitrogen, we want to do it at the point where the bacteria are going to be very inactive, because as long as they're not converting it to nitrate, as long as that nitrogen is going to stay in the urea or ammonium forms in the soil, we're not going to be at that risk for that large denitrification losses in the spring. So that's kind of where some of those timings and using different products can really tie into that. So that's where nitrogen gets lost. So let's talk a little bit of utilizing the 4 R's on what can we do to help reduce those losses. So number 1 is rate. So rate is kind of the easiest but the hardest one to kind of do. So rate, we all know, we've all seen those kind of graphs before where we kind of max out on the amount of nitrogen we could put down before we get an economic return on yield. And we do see that. So that is kind of a big thing. So rate is really kind of dialing in where do we want to be from a nitrogen rate application that the crop is going to kind of hit the point that we're not going to inhibit any more yield, but we're not going to waste by putting extra nitrogen down that we're not going to get any benefit from, which can be very difficult to try to predict because you have to try to plan out from a season and your yield targets and everything else. But everyone kind of has a number for their fields that they like to use. So I think it's good to kind of have that, but it's also good every year to do a little check on what you're doing. So it is good to maybe try a part of your field at either a little higher or a little lower nitrogen rate than maybe they're used to, and just to double check and see how are you doing from a nitrogen standpoint. Are you putting on a little too much? You could try dialing it back and see, do we get a yield loss? Or you could try adding a little more and seeing if maybe, we haven't been quite pushing it. We think we can push it a little more and see if you get a yield response, see if those numbers math out, and you're going to get a good return on investment. The one thing I will say about nitrogen, when you start playing with nitrogen rates, little changes are very hard to pick up. So if you are going to start playing around with maybe doing part of your field, whether it's just a pass or something like that you want to do, and you want to push that nitrogen up higher, or you want to dial it back a little bit, I'd recommend going at least 20% different than what you're doing. If you get into that 5-10% difference on your nitrogen rate, there's a good chance you're probably not going to pick that up within the field. So you kind of want to push it a little bit more than that 5-10%. And I recommend going about 20%. So easy math. If you're doing 100 pounds of actual N down on your fields, at least kind of dial that back to 80 if you want to see if you're adding too much, or push it to 120 if you want to see if that you have a little extra that you can kind of get a little bit more yield out of. So that's kind of my suggestion in terms of playing around with rate. But again, we want to have that target rate, and that's what we're aiming for. So pretty straightforward with the rate, because obviously if we have too much nitrogen out there, then we're not being efficient with our dollar values, we're not being efficient with our nitrogen. So, all right, timing. Timing's another challenging one, because one of the biggest things that we're going to see with timing is the weather. That's going to really dictate when we should put the nitrogen down. Now, I don't know about you, I'm not very good at predicting the weather. Because if I was, I probably would have picked a tropical vacation starting last week if I was any good at picking the weather, and I'm sure many others would be as well. And then I would have been showing up here, and I was probably going to say I'd come up tan, but let's face it, look at my complexion, come here sunburned in terms of that. So timing is a big thing, but it's really hard to predict. And we kind of know when crops kind of need their nitrogen, but it's really going to determine, again, we had all those factors getting into it on when that crop, how much that nitrogen is going to become available, and when it's going to become available, and when the crops need it. So certain crops typically, are grass crops, so whether it's wheat, barley, corn, oats, those crops tend to need nitrogen fairly significantly throughout their whole life cycle. Potatoes are another one that need nitrogen late. So those are kind of crops that you can really kind of look at doing some different kind of applications with it. Canola, on the other hand, it tends to need its nitrogen a lot more sooner than some of the other ones, so it gets a little harder to kind of play around a little bit with when to do those different nitrogen timings to make sure that you're getting the nitrogen out when the crop needs it. So that's going to be kind of the big thing. But one thing is consistent with all the crops is anytime we kind of have those small seedlings, they're not taking up a lot of nitrogen. So this is that time when we have potentially waste nitrogen that's sitting at risk for losses from the field, whether it's the volatilization losses, denitrification, leaching, because if that nitrogen's sitting and not being utilized, that's when it's being at risk for losses. Once we get to the point the crop is starting to do that rapid growth and it's pulling in a lot of water, going back to that 80% of the nitrogen coming in through nitrate and through the water, through the roots, it's going to start pulling that in, and we're at much less risk for having those losses from nitrogen when we're in that fast active growing phase of the crop. So that's kind of what we try to play around with timing, and that's why it's a little easier with some of these crops that need nitrogen more significant later versus ones that need it a little bit earlier. So that's kind of from a timing standpoint, really hard to predict. And again, same thing, it's a good plan to try playing around with different things. You can try different applications, split applications, but again, efficiency on your operations is going to go into that as well. There's only so much you can do once the field season gets going, and to try to do multiple applications across the field becomes very difficult logistically. All right, so placement. Now we're getting into things we can start to control a little bit more than we can in terms of the timing and maybe rate also, because we don't always know exactly what those yields are going to be, but we can start playing a lot more and have a little bit more control over the next couple ones. So placement is source. So we'll start on placement. So placement, there's a lot of different places we can put nitrogen and kind of see what we get for a response. So this is just kind of showing, coming from one specific trial, just looking at, excuse me, looking at those different application timings, and you can kind of get a bit of a response here on the yield. So we can do spring broadcast urea, again. From an efficiency standpoint, this is going to be really efficient. You can go cover a lot of acres real quick with a spring broadcast with it. But again, this is just bare urea, so we're not talking about source or anything like that on this one, just on that placement. Then we get to shallow band. This is what I'm going to say the majority of people are utilizing, especially when it comes to urea, the shallow band. So this would be anything from, call it, just below the soil surface down to about 2 inches would be considered shallow band. And then we get down to deep band at the far end there. Now, deep band is at 3 inches down. So this is kind of that iconic, placement in terms of where do we get the most efficiency from our nitrogen. There's a lot of work that was done back in the 60s, 70s, looking at that deep banding of nitrogen, and that is what we see. But we kind of sometimes forget about that. Sorry, excuse me. So we kind of forget about that, and we think of banding as banding, but banding is not always banding. There is the placement. And we do know when we get that nitrogen down 3 inches into the soil, there's very little that is going to be lost from a denitrification or a volatilization standpoint. Leaching is still at risk, but from the other two. Shallow banding, we're we're still at risk of loss from volatilization, definitely at risk at loss from denitrification and, of course, leaching. And shallow banding, or spring broadcast, is at risk really from that volatilization. We'll see, the biggest risk there. So placement is going to be a big thing of it. And you can manage it through kind of going back to the timing piece. If you're broadcasting, and we know we'll get some rainfall and into some actively growing crop, this can be really efficient, but it's much harder to predict. Shallow banding is probably one of the more simple ones, just because all the seeders out there are going to be set up with a side band, mid-row band, etc. Shallow banding tends to be where the bulk of our nitrogen is going to get applied. And then deep banding, we know it's the safest, but let's face it. How many people want to spend the time and go 3 inches down? Just think of the horsepower you're going to need. I haven't gone and looked at the tractors yet, but I'm sure the price tag is pretty steep on some that you're going to be able to pull an applicator and put your nitrogen down 3 inches, and you're not going to go real fast doing it either. So from the standpoint, but from an efficiency standpoint, that becomes very difficult. And that's kind of some of the things we kind of have to work through in terms of how do we manage that nitrogen. In terms of getting that moisture down, so I talked earlier before, when we put on the surface, we need that rainfall to work it down. So this is a really nice study that comes out of the U.S. and is looking, obviously they're using irrigation here to look at how much more rainfall do we need to put down in order to be able to get that nitrogen down so we reduce those volatilization losses. And this is where, as we kind of go through and kind of find on there, we want to be right around that 1/2 inch. This is kind of the ideal spot of rainfall to reduce those. So if anyone's doing any broadcast or even real shallow banding, you want to be able at that 1/2 inch rainfall, and that's going to get you down. Obviously, you get more than that, it's going to be good. The real risk becomes, and this happens every time, right? You think you're going to get decent rain, what do? You get a 1/10, maybe 2/10 of rain. Now we're sitting in a situation where we're at high risk for volatilization. So that is the risk of just putting untreated urea, just standard urea or just standard UAN out on the surface, and you only get that little bit of rain. We're at high risk of loss. And I'm pretty sure no one wants to see 30-40% of their nitrogen lost through volatilization in that situation. But it is good to kind of keep in mind, because we think, how much water do we need to actually get that nitrogen down? 1/2 inch is the number that we want to be targeting. And that's where, we know we'll get that nitrogen kind of pushed down far enough in the soil that we're going to help reduce these volatilization losses, and it's going to stay in the soil. Less than that, the risk goes up. And then also the bandings. We talked a little bit about the banding, and one of the benefits of having, a higher soil pH was you're going to be at less risk for ammonia volatilization. So again, you put your urea band or your UN band, an inch and a half, 2 inches down into the soil. You're still going to be at risk for some volatilization losses. Maybe not as much as at the surface, but definitely, farther down. But one of the things we see when we put nitrogen down is we start to get this bit of a band of higher pH. So here's an increase. So if you think about that, about 1.5 pH increase. So if you're sitting there and say you're sitting thinking pretty good, you got some fields that are maybe 5.5 pH, nice and acidic. They're at a situation where, that equilibrium should be pushed more towards ammonium. It's a, heavier soil, should be holding on to it. But when we put the band and the more nitrogen we put down, we're going to get that high pH increasing happen right around it. So if it goes up 1.5, your 5.5 now just became 7. So now all of a sudden you're now getting into that more basic side, and you're going to push that conversion over here, or that equilibrium over here. And that's what this graph over here is showing. So this is your ammonium and your ammonia. We're looking at your pH differences here. So if you're sitting in a situation where you're going to be pretty low ammonia, mostly ammonium, but as that pH spikes right around the prill, and again, as you put in a band, that pH concentration has potential to spike more. So if you think about that, so kind of more of a sweep application, you're going to have more individual prills. You're not going to probably see as much of a spike, and then you go to a side band, that's going to spike a little more, and a mid-row band, now you're taking 2x your nitrogen, you're putting it all in one band, you're going to have the potential to spike right around there quite a bit higher, and that's going to push that equilibrium over. So if you're not down far enough and you haven't had any rainfall, you do run a risk with it. So there's a lot of factors that play into placement and how that affects your potential nitrogen losses. And then this one is just kind of showing, because UAN is not immune to it as well. Half of UAN is urea, so we are at risk for that ammonia volatilization losses. The other half of it is at risk for the denitrification leaching. Well, all of it is at risk for those, but there is the process there. But from an ammonia volatilization, so that's what this. Whoops, my apologies. Pressed the wrong button. So if we look at the ammonia volatilization, looking at some different ways of putting UAN. So broadcast UAN, dribble band, injected, shallow incorporation. Just looking at some of those, and then these are kind of it's a meta-analysis looking at it, but look at average on the far side here. This is the percent of nitrogen as lost. So they're all sitting there as a potential for loss depending on what's happening with it. So really, from an ammonia volatilization point, if we're not getting it down that 3 inches, like that kind of going back to that historic stuff, we still have that ammonia volatilization risk that can happen. So we can see here broadcast UAN, 19% on average, dribble banding, 22%, injected 25%, and shallow incorporated 16% with an average of 20%, which is still pretty significant from the standpoint of loss from UAN, just from half of it from the volatilization losses. So those are some things to kind of consider in terms of that with how do we manage through that. So now we can kind of go into source. Now, source is definitely something that gets a lot of focus in terms of nitrogen management, and it is really good in terms of that. One of the things we can do with the source of your nitrogen is now we can start to play around with it, and we can actually take some of these practices that are maybe a little on the worst side from a loss standpoint, and we can actually bring them now the other way and start making them more effective just by choosing the source and which source and what the use is with that. And that's one of the things that just kind of go through is there's a number of different sources of nitrogen, and I'm going to focus now more on kind of the efficient nitrogen, the ones that are kind of targeted and available for use to help kind of reduce these losses. So that's kind of the next step here is some of those sources. So the first one I want to go through is polymer-coated. So polymer-coated urea is exactly what it sounds like. You use a polymer and you coat your urea prill. So that's usually kind of changes analysis. Usually it's about a 4400 with it. But you've got a granule coated in this polymer, and that polymer is going to need moisture, time, temperature to crack because it's going to protect water from getting in there. But eventually there's going to be a crack in it. The water is going to get in. It's going to start to dissolve that urea, and then the dissolved urea is going to start coming out of the polymer. So that's how it works, and it's really kind of focused on that time standpoint, right? You're delaying that nitrogen from moving out and going through the whole conversion over to ammonia and ammonium till later in the season when hopefully that crop is actively growing. When we think about that, that's going to be kind of the big piece with understanding for the polymer coated and where it's going to work. Now, the same things are going to happen at that point when it releases. We're still going to be at the point, if it's at the surface, higher amounts of ammonia volatilization are at potential there with it, so it does need to get moved down into the soil. Or same thing, once it comes out, it's still at risk for denitrification, saturated soils, or leaching as well. So it's polymer coated. And then we get into probably the more confusing ones. So this is kind of the enhanced efficiency nitrogen. So this is the chemical products that you can utilize to reduce nitrogen loss. And we kind of have them categorized as single inhibitors and dual inhibitors. So there's two types of single inhibitors. So we have our urease inhibitor. So if we go back to the urease enzyme, inhibits that enzyme there. And then we have the nitrification inhibitor. So again, that nitrification process, moving from ammonia to nitrate, that's nitrification. It's going to inhibit that process along the way. And then we have the dual inhibitors. And so it just contains both a urease inhibitor and a nitrification inhibitor. So again, it's pretty straightforward. There's two types of singles, one type of dual. And then within that, there are a number of different products that fall into that. So as we kind of go through each of these, we can kind of talk a little bit about that. So if we look at the urease inhibitors, so this is kind of how it works, and this gets used a lot when we talk about urease inhibitors, is the little Pac-Man. And what we're trying to do basically is the same thing that we do with anytime we try to inhibit an enzyme, is we want to block that enzyme from the availability. So if we look at the far end here, if we've got urea and NBPT, one of the urease inhibitors, they're competing for that active site on that enzyme. And what we're trying to do is we want to make sure that we're coating, we have enough NBPT in there that's going to interfere with that, because once that inserts in here, it'll become NBPTO. That's going to bind in. Again, this eventually it will get broken down, so that enzyme will become available again, and then it'll either move on to another NBPT or it'll find the urea, and it'll start the process of hydrolysis to make urea move all the way to ammonia and ammonium. So basically, what we're trying to do, just block that by using something else that looks kind of like urea, that isn't urea, to block that enzyme. So as we kind of look at that, we also have to understand that how much of that urease enzyme we put into the soil is going to have an effect on it. And we tend to think of, we coat these fertilizers, but a lot of times with these chemical products, we're not coating them to protect the urea. We're actually using the urea itself as a carrier to move the chemical to the soil, so that way it can hopefully interfere with the hydrolysis process and keep it as urea, where it's going to be nice and stable until we get those rainfalls to kind of wash that nitrogen down, or the incorporation process to get it moved down as well. So we do have to think about parts per million, or how much of that urease inhibitor is available for the in the soil to help kind of run those blocks. So that's what this graph is just showing here, is just looking at the different types of, or different concentrations of NBPT. So NBPT is kind of the most common urease inhibitor that is out there. So most of the products are going to utilize NBPT in terms of urease inhibitor. And looking at different rates, so we've got 0 parts per million at this top line, 200 parts per million, 400 parts per million, and 600 parts per million. And the parts per million is just kind of telling you how much is in there versus how much nitrogen, right? So just how many parts per million per nitrogen, so of the NBPT in there, so that way we can kind of have an easy measurement to look at those different concentrations. And we can see here there is a decent effect. And this is typically what a volatilization curve will look like. Like I said, it usually takes 24 to 48 hours for the process to start. And you'll see a rapid spike, and then it kind of peters out. And then we kind of tap out on what our total loss is going to be. In this case, we're running at 35% of the nitrogen lost as untreated, looking at that. And then looking at the other ones, we cap out a little lower, 25, probably about 22-ish. At the very end there, 21, 22% of the nitrogen loss. But what's kind of interesting when you look at kind of through it is, There it goes. If we look at it kind of a time frame over that, what we're kind of doing is we're stretching it kind of the other way. If you kind of almost look at it from the other standpoint now, if we look at the main parts, this rapid loss part on each of these lines, we're stretching that over now. So this is a line at 6 days, looking at how far we can push that over. And as we can push that longer, we can think of that crop's getting bigger, it's starting to pull out more nitrogen. There's a better chance we're going to get a rainfall. Better chance that we'll get out there and have an incorporation event, whatever it might be that we're trying to get that nitrogen in and kind of push it that way. So that's kind of the big piece of it. To look at that is giving ourselves more time to stop that conversion, for that crop to get rapidly growing, get rainfall, get everything, kind of get the situation where the nitrogen is going to get moved down into the soil, and the crop is going to have quick access to it. So the less time it's sitting there in a form that's prone to loss, the less losses we're going to have overall. So we're looking kind of those numbers at 6 days, untreated 31%, 200 parts per million 15%, 400 parts per million is 8%, and the 600 parts per million 5%. So just kind of looking at some of those numbers at the same kind of day, 6-day time frame. There's also different products out there that can be used. So I mentioned NBPT. So that's what would be on the Agritane piece there, was the original one that was utilized as a urease inhibitor. And there are different products out. So there is Duramide is another one, and there's NPPT would be the ones, the three ones that fall in the urease inhibitor. And again, they're all going to perform differently in terms of how that looks. So again, depending on the parts per million and everything, that is going to have an effect as well. I'll skip that one. So basically, this is just looking at the UAN loss in terms of what does that mean now. So if we kind of look at the nitrogen loss here, so going back to volatilization here and the terms of total nitrogen, if we kind of look at that from a UAN standpoint, if we kind of get to the end of the day there, we have 50 pounds of nitrogen loss potentially just through volatilization after application. And then by treating it, we can get to the point where we're 31 pounds saved by treating it. So that's kind of what I talk about when we can start to take different sources and utilize different products. We can kind of start to play around with that. So this would be a surface application of nitrogen going on, so putting it at a high-risk situation, and then treating it, we can pull that down. And again, you can start to change these things. You don't have to keep each of these 4 Rs in an individual thing, right? We can incorporate a source with the timing, or source with the rate. They all tie together is kind of the big thing to take away with it, and we can kind of start to manipulate them and try to prevent some of these nitrogen losses that we are seeing. All right, so nitrification inhibitors, on the other hand, so as I mentioned, they focus on this AMO enzyme here with nitrous ammonium bacteria. So this is what we're trying to stop, this conversion here. And the reason we're doing that is we want to keep the majority of it as ammonium early in the season. Because ammonium is a plant-available form of nitrogen if the plant finds it, but it's going to be at a much less risk for loss of denitrification leaching until that crop gets rapidly growing. And then we can get to the conversion of nitrate, and as the plant's pulling water, to pull that nitrate in. So when we think of a nitrification inhibitor, we are targeting this enzyme right here in this process. So, same thing. What we're trying to do here is basically just run interference. It's the same concept. Got the fancy little Pac-Man here again. That's the look at target. It's a different enzyme and a different thing using kind of different metals in terms of that. But if we think of ammonia in the soil, and then we're using our nitrification inhibitor. So again, we're talking about DCD on this one. And again, there are kind of 4 different ones. I probably should have mentioned the last slide with it. There are 4 different nitrification inhibitors. So DCD is kind of the most common one that's out there, and it's one of the oldest. It's been around for over 80 years in terms of things. So there's been a lot of science on it. And then there's DMPP and pronitridine, and they are called the bacteriostatic nitrification inhibitors, which means that they will inhibit on this enzyme here on the bacteria, so they'll stop it, but they don't hurt the bacteria in any way. They're basically just blocking it. The bacteria will clear it out, and then it'll either look for it's looking for ammonium again, and again, we want to kind of target that, make sure we have enough of the product in there to be able to Get the point that it's likely going to block it before it finds more of the ammonium. The fourth one I didn't mention was nitropyrin, also one of the original ones too that was found, I think, also roughly about 80 years ago. They found that one. It's a bactericide product. It actually does differently. It targets the bacteria and kills the bacteria versus the bacteriostatic one. So just same concept, just different ways of going about it. Kind of thing. So again, we want to make sure that we're putting enough of that product because that's kind of the big thing that we have with the source with it, and kind of in terms of making sure that there's enough in there. So this kind of shows that because with the kind of the nitrifications, we don't get the same kind of nice little graphs that we saw with the urease inhibitors, right? With the urease inhibitors, we kind of saw there the different ones, the different concentrations that had kind of an effect. The nitrification inhibitors seem a little bit more cut and dry. You tend to see that they're going to have an impact or they're not going to have an impact on that bacteria, and we need to make sure that we have the right rate in there. And one of the reasons I kind of keep going back to the rate concentration of these products is probably one of the things that most people don't realize is that there is no efficacy requirements when you get these products registered, because they are registered through the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and it is not their mandate to manage efficacy products. They do for safety and a quality standpoint. So it is very different than what we tend to think about in agriculture with our crop production products. Protection products, which are regulated through the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, which do have an efficacy requirement through their registration. So that is a slight difference, and something that is always good just to kind of reiterate that there is no efficacy requirement to get a product registered from the source standpoint, and it's to make sure that you are asking questions about the products and making sure that we're getting enough product out there to make sure it is actually going to do what you're hoping it's going to do in your field. And what we're trying to do with that, when we get enough of that product out there, is to make sure that we extend the time. So this is a laboratory study now, looking at untreated ammonia versus treated ammonia. So this is aqueous ammonia, so it's all done, so it's not like anhydrous ammonia, it's aqueous ammonia done in a lab, and looking at how long it takes to get from 0% nitrate, so it would be all ammonia, to 100% nitrate. So it's just looking at that the time for total conversion. At two different temperatures, 24 degrees Celsius and 11 degrees Celsius. So 24 degrees Celsius, so quite a warm temperature with that. This is going to happen real quick. So we're going to see that happen in about 2 weeks. So we're going to get 100% conversion. But by treating with a nitrification inhibitor, now we can stretch that out a little bit. So now we're getting out closer to about 6 weeks in terms of how long that takes. And again, it's not going to be kind of an on-off situation. You are going to have nitrate availability as it's tested throughout. You'll see, there will be a conversion until it gets to that 100% conversion. Now, if we go to a much cooler temperature, looking at 11 degrees Celsius, and I kind of mentioned earlier, right, with bacteria, whatever the number someone uses, 5 degrees, 8 degrees, 10 degrees, we know 11's on the cooler side. We start to see that stretches that out a lot longer, right? So we get those cooler temperatures in the soil. It's going to take much longer now for that conversion to happen. Those bacteria are not going to be nearly as active as they are in the warm temperature. And again, when we treat it, we really start to stretch that out. And at 12 weeks here, we're not even at 40% conversion, so it's going to take a while. But we know fields are not laboratories, right? We're not going to get a standard soil temperature the entire time. So we are going to see some differences in there. You think about a springtime, the soil's cold, you're out there seeding whatever crop it is you're putting in, maybe the soil temperature is 8 degrees Celsius, 10, 12 degrees Celsius. It's going to be pretty slow. What happens, right, as time goes on, your soil temperature is going to start to increase, the bacteria are going to get more active, right, and you're going to see that conversion over time. So from a spring standpoint. Versus in the fall, you're kind of going the other way, right? In the fall, if you're doing a fall application, you're going to start, warmer, and then you're going to start to cool off. So it's going to look a little differently there, which is why we want to target kind of those later fall applications, but before freezing, to put any nitrogen out in the fall. And that's one of the big things we see with anhydrous ammonia for those applications out there. What do we want to look at doing with anhydrous ammonia in the fall? We tend to have that rule of thumb, right? After Thanksgiving, we put out anhydrous ammonia. That's when it's going down, and to make sure that those bacteria are not active and it's not going to do that conversion is what we're trying to do with it. So this is kind of just looking at treated versus untreated ammonia, looking at two different application dates. So the first application date, September 30th, So obviously, much too early, right, to really be going out there versus October 15th. So that I know that after Thanksgiving time frame, looking at the application. And so what we see here, this is looking at pounds of ammonium. So measured in the spring, so this would be after the application was in the fall, the measurements were taken in the spring, and looking at how much ammonium was still in the soil. And so we have 11 pounds of the ammonium still left as, or nitrogen left as ammonium from September 30th, which makes sense, right? We put ammonia too early, the conversion happened, which means that we had a lot of nitrate sitting there going into winter, which means in the spring it was at risk for denitrification losses. And we talk about that spring snowmelt, that's our highest denitrification, so we probably lost a lot of nitrogen from this application. However, if we actually treat it, we can start to push that a little bit earlier. We still have 88 pounds of nitrogen left as ammonium, so it's doing pretty good from maintaining that standpoint. We go to October 15th, that after Thanksgiving, it's going to depend on year to year. Some years we get a bit of more open fall, some we get a really short fall, and it's going to change a little bit. But we're still seeing 63 pounds left as ammonium, which means the majority is still ammonium, less of it converted to nitrate. So it kind of fits with what we know about applications in the fall, is making sure that later we can go, the more of it's going to be kept as ammonium, and the less that we're going to be at risk for losing over the winter, or in the spring when it actually starts to melt. But if we treat it, now we're keeping pretty much all of it as ammonium. Obviously, sampling is not 100% effective. I can't say that the treatment gave you the extra pound of nitrogen as ammonium, but it does kind of give you kind of that guidelines in terms of what do we see there. So there are some advantages to, again, going back to the 4 R's, choosing a source, so using a stabilizer product with your ammonia, and then choosing your timing as well, right? If you can get to the point where we can get to where those soil temperatures are cooling, you're going to keep the majority as ammonium, and that means you're going to be at very low risk of losing, because the loss in the spring is going to happen from anything that is at nitrate, at freeze up, to in the spring when it melts and saturates, that's where we're going to see that loss as denitrification. So. All right, and so if we kind of move now into the kind of last piece, the dual inhibitors. So dual inhibitors, as I kind of mentioned, focus on reducing ammonia volatilization. They also help on reducing the leaching and denitrification piece as well. So when we want to think about using dual inhibitors, we want to kind of think about when we should use those is at a time when that nitrogen is going to be applied in a situation where it is at risk for volatilization, but then it can be at risk also for denitrification and leaching. And one of the prime examples of that is kind of fall broadcast applications. And so by using a dual inhibitor, you can kind of, again, going back to that comment about how you can take kind of a practice that's maybe on the higher risk side, and we can now bring it into something that is going to be at the potential to have protected because you're using a source that's going to fit from that application. So that's just looking here at kind of these different applications. So this would be an application with a dual inhibitor in the fall compared to broadcasted. So a very high risk situation in terms of nitrogen loss. Looking at it compared to a spring broadcast of untreated urea. So again, a higher risk, but not as high of a risk from that standpoint, because again, it is at a point where it's going to be closer to time of planting. You're avoiding that fall, high denitrification or spring denitrification after snow melt, versus the old true and standard, the 3-inch deep banding here, and just looking at the effect there, where we know it is the safest way to put your nitrogen down is 3 inches down and having good trench closure. That's going to keep the majority of your nitrogen there, and just looking at those. So again, do we kind of, in a situation, we take a high-risk situations, and by choosing a source, this might be chosen from an efficiency standpoint, from an operation, and can we do that? We can use, a product that is a dual inhibitor that will actually protect from that, and that puts it on par with kind of a spring broadcast. It is a higher risk, so we're not achieving quite the exact impact of going the safest, but you can measure that now from an efficiency standpoint. If you kind of have a slight, statistically they're not significant, but from a slight yield thing, you're losing probably about 5 bushels on that versus that, but so there is a cost to that. But now you're looking at how many acres you're able to cover from a standpoint. You have less fills from your in your seeder in the spring to go forward versus something that we know is going to be a very low risk, but is going to be economically and labor-intensive application. So a lot of this in terms of management, your nitrogen loss, has to be a balance between the economics, the efficiencies, and then the loss that you're going to be looking at as well. And then finally, kind of thing from the standpoint of dual inhibitors is looking, kind of swinging back around to nitrous oxide. Just because this is something that has been discussed a fair bit. This is just looking at a meta-analysis, looking at a number of different studies, and then comparing them from the different types of inhibitors, and what we see from an environmental standpoint in terms of production of nitrous oxide, and what we see. And this is pretty consistent, what we see typically from it. Urease inhibitors, oops, wrong button. Urease inhibitors over here, if we look at the average from the meta-analysis, 13% reduction in nitrous oxide using urease inhibitor. Nitrification inhibitor, 49%, and a dual inhibitor, 31%, and you kind of see that. And again, going to why do we kind of tend to see this? Well, typically, it's going to be from the risk of application. We know that a urease inhibitor is going to do an okay job at reducing some loss, just because we're going to protect it from kind of those ammonia volatilization losses. You're going to keep more of the nitrogen there and allow it time to get down into the soil for a crop to utilize. But if we're talking just from a straight loss from nitrous oxide or nitrous oxide focus, we're not probably going to see the benefit. We know the nitrification inhibitors are going to be kind of they tend to be the best just based on their application, because again, you're not going to want to put that nitrogen anywhere near the surface. It's going to get banded down farther into the soil, so you're not kind of at a risk there. And then dual inhibitors, well, they're kind of the jack of all trades, right? They kind of get used in kind of the highest risk situations, so to help kind of manage that. So they're kind of put off at a bit of a disadvantage from the get-go in terms of that, but it's pretty consistent from what we see from a lot of these studies with it. So what does that all mean in terms of that? Because there's a lot of information that went through. How do I make it kind of simple for someone to take home and really kind of understand what it is from a product they want to be utilizing depending on what it is? So if we start on the left here, so the nitrification inhibitors. So when do we use those? This is going to protect from nitrate loss. You can use it in ammonia, anhydrous ammonia, urea, UAN, because all of those are going to be at risk for nitrogen loss through denitrification and leaching. When should you use just the nitrification, just that single inhibitor? Obviously, as I mentioned, injected, incorporated. So when it goes into the soil, because we're not worried about volatilization losses at that point. When you're able to incorporate it into the soil, that's when you should use it. Fall and early spring applications, because again, that's when we're going to see more saturation. It's going to get to nitrate faster because we're not protecting from that from the urease. We're not slowing that urease in part down, the conversion over. Or if it's anhydrous ammonia, it's already halfway there. So we're not slowing that down. So we want to make sure that there's going to be a bit of time before it gets nitrate, so the crop's actively growing and can take it up. And again, that's going to help reduce our risk of leaching and denitrification. When do we use a dual inhibitor? So that's that urease and nitrification. So again, you want it close to the surface. You're going to broadcast or lightly incorporate. Maybe you're just going to harrow it or something like that. So it's not going to get real far down. You're going to make sure you want that urease inhibitor. But this is an early application. So you're doing a fall or early season application. And then that's when you're going to need that nitrification inhibitor to protect against that. And that's going to protect from all three forms of loss. And when do you only need a urease inhibitor? So that's going to be on urea UAN, volatilization. This one also urea UAN, and that's because there's no need to use a urease inhibitor with anhydrous ammonia because there's no urea in it at all. So it's just urea containing nitrogen sources. So you're going to use that when it is broadcasted or, again, shallow banded, lightly incorporated because it's going to be at risk for volatilization losses. So top dress, surface applications, any of those kind of situations where you're going to leave that nitrogen close to the surface, but you're doing it at a point when the crop is there. So maybe you're doing a top dress, or maybe you're going to broadcast it after you've seeded or something along those times. That is really, when a urease inhibitor is going to kind of shine and kind of keep it there because we know we're going to get some rainfall that's going to incorporate. Maybe you've got irrigation, you can water it in, something along those lines to help protect against against it. Top dress is a big one for anyone who does play around with UAN or even urea top dress, because when you broadcast that into the soil, or maybe you're using dribble bands, Y drops, whatever you might be using there to put your nitrogen down, you're putting in a crop. That canopy, it's going to be warm, it's going to be humid, there's going to be lots of urease enzyme out there. It's at a very high risk for volatilization losses. We tend to see some pretty high volatilization losses just because it has all those factors that go with it due to humidity, heat, and everything that goes with it. So again, we want to protect it from ammonia volatilization. So that is kind of, hopefully it kind of brings you around, takes you something home that you can kind of think about from your operation. I know, again, there's a lot of confusion between these different products or categories and trying to understand that. And so, yeah, if anyone does have any questions and they want to reach out, you can gather my contact information. If anyone is tech savvy, and I can't take any credit for this, you can scan this QR code and actually save my contact information directly into your phone as well. So again, I don't know if we have time for any questions. Yeah. So I don't know if there's any questions from anyone in the audience.
Oh, right there. Go ahead.
Oh, yes. Sure.
Oh, he's coming. He's coming with
Oh, we got a microphone coming. Okay.
I'm just wondering if the different products, the inhibitor products, vary significantly in terms of half-life or how long they're active in the soil, or is this something we're generally trying to manipulate with rates?
No, that's a great question. No, so the different active ingredients will have different lengths of how active they are in the soil. So if you kind of think about, there's one slide I had, I won't bring it back up, that compared duramide to NBPT. So duramide will tend to last about 30% longer than NBPT within the soil because it's a longer chain, takes longer to break down, and everything that goes with it. So that's why typically something that contains a duramide active ingredient will also contain some NBPT because it's going to be a little faster, a little quicker, it'll burn through, and then the duramide's there. So you can kind of manipulate those. Same as NPPT. It's going to be a little closer to NBPT, but same thing. Anything that contains NPPT typically will contain both NBPT and NPPT. If we jump to the nitrification inhibitors, it's going to be a little different. We don't tend to probably see as much differences there. What we tend to see is more how the mode of action works with the nitrification inhibitor. So as I mentioned, nitropyrin tends to be bactericide, kills the bacteria. DMPPA and DCD tend to be just straight competitive inhibitors, so we need fairly high rates of those because they're actually blocking the target site. Pronitridine tends to be a non-competitive inhibitor, so that means it's actually altering the target site, so rather than typically just totally blocking the active site. So depending on which side we look at, so they will behave differently and have different half-lives within it, but typically we see that more on the urease inhibitor, less on the nitrification inhibitor, and then we try to manipulate rates because we're playing, the odds. And one of the things we do see with the urease inhibitors, there's a little more gray area within the rates. We tend to see more overlap just based on, it's going to depend on your soil type, it's going to depend on how much urease inhibitor is in the soil, residues, like it definitely becomes a little bit more muted with it versus when we see the nitrification, because we're targeting a bacteria, same as, you target a fungi or, anything else, right? It's a little easier to dial down and dial in and see what those specific rates are on something like that. So, does that hopefully answers your question? Okay, perfect. Any other questions?
I don't see any more. Thanks, Bryce.
All right,
Very,
thank you.
very informative, and thanks for attending.
All right, thank you.